So hi everyone, my name's Emily Mayer. Today I'm going to be talking with you about aquatic plants in the Musconetcong River. So I'm a research scientist with the Bureau of Freshwater and Biological Monitoring with NJDEP. So prior to DEP, I worked in consulting for over a decade, focused mostly on aquatic plant mapping as well as harmful algal bloom management. Today, some of the content that we'll be going over was contributed and provided by Chris Doyle, who is my mentor, and Susan Knight, who also taught him all about aquatic plants as well. Okay. So we're going to start off by talking about some very useful websites. Again, you have to be careful when it comes to the internet as far as what you're looking at. So these are some of the trusted websites that I particularly go to, especially when I need to figure out or get into the ballpark of what plant I'm looking at, especially if you're not comfortable with taxonomic keys. This is a great place to start. So University of Florida, they have a Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants. That is where actually I went to earn my master's. So they have a really useful website there with line drawings, videos, all about aquatic plants. USDA also has a bunch of different plant profiles. Go Botany also has some great pictures and resources there. Lake Stewards of Maine, they have a actual PDF guide on their website that is free for download. So I definitely encourage you all to take a look at that. And then also as well as Flora of Wisconsin, again, you have to be careful because certain plants are only specific to different areas throughout the country. So definitely be careful as far as that goes. Some other really great resources are these books. I do have a few that are out on the table. Feel free to take a look at that. We also have some pickled plant samples. Please do not open them. There is formaldehyde in them, but feel free to take a look at some of those. So we have our first book, The Aquatic and Wetland Plants of Northeastern North America, written by Barry Hellquist. He is the godfather of aquatic plant identification. This is his most recent release, which has information on more genetically accurate plants. We also have Maine Field Guide for Invasive Aquatic Plants. So this one focuses more on the invasives and native lookalikes. So again, this is free online and available for download. We also have Midwest Plants, which provides excellent photos for this guide as well. And then we have Through the Looking Glass here. This is kind of my also go-to book. We have a copy of that on the table over there. That one has really great line drawings, very great descriptions, especially when you're first starting out as a beginner for aquatic plant identification as well. And then we have another guide called The Aquatic Plants of the Northeast. This is completely free and is available on NEAPMS website. Myself and Chris Doyle worked in collaboration with them to develop this guide. So it is out there and available for download now.
It's all printed on right in the rain paper.
Yes, yep. So you can print that out and have copies of that as well. So I definitely encourage that. We have a copy over there that you all can look at. And so starting out with aquatic plant types and the basics. So we have emergent plants, which we're not really going to talk about today. That's like a whole separate other presentation. But that would be your cattails, your sedges, your duck potatoes. Then we have submersed plants, which we're going to talk a little bit about. So that's your pondweeds, your milfoils, your naiads. So these plants are going to more than likely occur in the littoral zone. So typically in a lake setting, that's within about 10 to 14 feet deep would be your littoral zone. Anything deeper than that, typically you're not going to have plants growing in that. However, that's a different story. If you're in the Adirondacks, I've seen plants grow up to 25 feet deep in water. Then we have our floating leaves. So that's your water lilies, your water shields, and then your free floating plants, which can kind of move around based on wind and wave action. So that's your duckweeds, your water meals.
So the maximum depth, right, is that dependent somewhat on water clarity as well? Like you mentioned,
Mhm.
Adirondacks where perhaps the water, so that's the sun can penetrate.
Yep.
Deeper in that case. And then second question, my apologies if you're going to get into this later, but like when we're talking about all these different plants,
Mhm.
what proportion of them are actually invasives versus?
We're going to talk about that. Sorry. Yeah. So we'll address that in a little bit. So what are some of the benefits of aquatic plants? So they do provide quite a bit of habitat for fish, aquatic invertebrates. It serves as refuge for zooplankton that move about the water column throughout the day. It can also provide as a food resource for different wildlife like beavers that are chewing on some yellow lilies right there. But they can also serve as a nutrient sink and kind of can compete with algae. It's all a balancing act. A lot of times you'll see when there's an abundance of aquatic plants, that algae clinging to those plants, providing more water clarity in the water. However, as time goes on and these plants start to decompose, they can contribute nutrients to the water column as well. And then plants can also provide shoreline and benthic stabilization as well along the shoreline, and can help reduce nutrients that are coming in. So building out those buffers along those edges. And of course, they can serve as an aesthetic purpose as well. But at nuisance levels, they can cause a variety of problems. So they can restrict recreational activities, boat movement, as you can see here, fishing frustrations, getting your fishing line caught up in the dense weeds. It can also not look pretty. And it can also cause ecological imbalances, shifts in fish communities, and it can also contribute to negative water quality impacts, especially from invasive aquatic plants as well. And overall can decrease property values, as well as potentially be a spot for harboring potentially harmful algal cyanobacteria. Recent studies have come out on a particular cyanobacteria that can grow on aquatic plants and actually cause diseases within predatory birds. So that's something that is currently being looked at within the Northeast and currently being tested. So you can see here in this picture where it kind of almost looks like a lawn, that's all water chestnut. If someone didn't know and tried to walk on that, they fall right in. So, and with nuisance levels of aquatic plants, this can also cause safety issues. In the past, there have been potential drownings that have happened, so management of this is important. And so invasive species, generally when we find the invasive species, we're somewhere in the containment and long-term management area. A lot of times we're not in the eradication section where we're finding small localized populations unless we're screening for it or actively looking for that. A lot of times, again, when I worked in consulting, it was when we were in the containment or long-term management area that people would notice, oh, hey, there's a problem, and now we have to try to manage this. Very rarely do we use the word eradication because it's very difficult to eradicate these species, and a lot of times it just comes down to managing it. So we're going to very briefly go over some basic leaf anatomy before I get into the nitty-gritty of things. So When I say alternate, this is what I mean by alternate leaf arrangements, opposite, and world. So you'll hear me mention some of these terms, and you'll hear me mention things like leaf margins, serrated edges, finely divided, and different leaf shapes as well. Unfortunately, this is a terrestrial plant, but same idea with the different features that we're going to briefly talk about throughout this presentation. So this is a list of the few, and I really had to narrow it down. It was very difficult because I could go on and on talking about aquatic plants all day, but we're limited on time here. And so any of the ones that are highlighted in red are considered invasive. Anything that is highlighted in green is considered a macroalgae. Anything that has asterisks next to it, potentially you could find it within the river if there's some like ponded areas off to the side or some very, very slow moving sections of the river.
I was going to ask you because the current may dictate what types of plant species are there, but river isn't like a homogeneous, flow area.
It can change too.
And what's there may look different than what's current, but or maybe there are species that are tolerant.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we have curly leaf pondweed. So I'm going to refer to the plants with their common name. The Latin name is up there if you'd like to reference that, but I'm going to just talk about common names for now. So this is the only invasive pondweed that we have. It's native to Europe and Asia, and it's pretty well established throughout the Northeast and most of the US. This is considered an early grower, so typically you'll see this start to pop up in April, May, and then it'll start to naturally die off June, July. However, if you do your surveys at the end of the summer, you might come across a few stragglers here and there. So this tends to reproduce through fragmentation or something called turions. They're these kind of pine cone-like seeds, essentially, that can stay dormant in the sediment. And this plant, you can kind of tell that it's curly leaf pondweed based on the leaves. So they kind of have this wavy effect. Sometimes I like to think of different items or things that remind me of what this plant is to help me remember. So it kind of looks like bacon. It kind of looks like lasagna. So that's just another quick tip when identifying these plants. We have brittle naiad. This one is an invasive. So typically this is a low grower, but you can see visibly with your eye these toothed or serrated edges. These leaves are kind of curled over entirely, and they have 6 to 20 spines overall. This one is a prolific seed producer, so tucked in the axil area where the stem is where you'll kind of see those seeds to help further with your identification if you really want to make sure that it is brittle naiad. And 1 acre plot can produce 10 million viable seeds. I feel really bad for whatever grad student had to count all of that.
What are these? You mentioned segmentation as a way of spreading.
Fragmentation, yeah.
Fragmentation.
Yeah.
Which means basically any part of the
Mhm.
start a new.
Yep. So it can move to another area, reroot, regrow.
I know what the animal is.
Absolutely.
Spreading. Some of these, like when you're shooting now, it's like.
Oh yeah.
Much, right?
Nope, it does not take much. Oh yeah. Yeah, and we'll talk about a few others in the presentation, but there are some that have different reproductive strategies that can make it even more successful to grow.
You showed earlier,
Mhm.
actual seed.
Yep. Yep. So seeds, but it can also reproduce through fragmentation as
Oh,
well.
okay.
Yeah. So it has multiple modes of reproduction.
Wonder it's so hard.
Yeah. So brittle naiad is typically a low grower, so less likely of management happening there, but again, it depends on the lake management and the lake association, and again, what your goals are. So we have Eurasian water milfoil. This one's very common, and I believe is at one of the climate stations. So this one is native to Europe and Asia, and it has kind of like these spaghetti-like stems. So it has a white to reddish appearance. Again, in the literature, you might see some reference to colors, or it looks like this color or that color. Color is not something to always depend upon, because you have to think about when you're finding this plant, is it degrading already, that type of thing. So take that with a grain of salt. But this species can grow up to 20 feet long and has leaves that are in a whorl around the stem. So coming off of the stem are the leaflets and the leaflet pairs. So these finely divided pairs here. So there are a variety of different milfoil species, but this one in particular has 12 to 21 leaflet pairs per leaf. And the spacing is important to look at as well when it comes to identifying this one.
Was that the flower?
Yes. Yep.
And that sticks above the wall.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is the one for some reason I hear about all of those,
Oh, yeah.
because I guess it's big.
It's pretty widespread, yeah, at this point.
To get, maybe you're talking, they have all these programs, physical, back every year.
Oh, yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I see this firsthand fishing, but it just chokes.
Oh, yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know what it does to the habitat for fish. Maybe they like.
Mm.
I don't know, but something along the oxygen.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It can.
Probably that bad thing.
Oh, yeah. So when aquatic plants start to die off later in the season, or depending on what its growth pattern is, when it starts to die off, it can suck up all that oxygen and then cause stress on other aquatic biota within the habitat. So stressing them out, potentially causing fish kills, things like that.
I mean, there's places I go to fish in the spring and then go back later
Mhm.
in the summer and they're totally choked.
Oh, yeah.
They don't see fishing.
Yeah, yeah. So it does produce this pink flower if you get a chance to see that, where it sticks up out of the water and protrudes. So you can kind of see here, this stem right here is slightly inflated, so that helps it with buoyancy of keeping that upright. And it does have multiple competitive advantages. It tends to like to thrive in cool water, a variety of different habitats and different water quality settings as well. It can create these dense canopy formations as well.
When's it?
So typically it can start to flower in June, July, as early as that. But you can see it all throughout August, September. So we have our native common waterweed. So typically you'll see this with leaves in whorls of 3. Sometimes it might be more than 3, and that's from my understanding from the literature, especially when it starts to grow. Sometimes you might see at one spot it might have multiple. That's just part of its growing pattern. But the majority of the time you're going to see 3 leaves in a whorl. They have somewhat of a blunt tips at the end here, and the leaves are mostly crowded at the tip here. This can have varying appearances because there is, of course, another species of common waterweed called Elodea nutalii. According to botanists and geneticists, the only way to tell is by genetic testing. And of course, they can hybridize. So not something to be too concerned about, as nutalii isn't considered invasive, but just something to know if the leaves look a little longer, you know, something to consider. You have heart pondweed. So this is very similar to Richardson's pondweed or clasping leaf pondweed, which we'll talk about next. But this one has no floating leaves, so it doesn't produce floating leaves like lilies or anything like that. This is completely a submersed plant. So they have more oval or rounder shaped leaves. And they're typically a bit smaller with the leaf overall. And with this one in particular, what helps me remember how to ID this one is that the leaves completely wrap around the stem. So think of it as like giving it a loving hug, heart pondweed, around the stem. And this one typically has 7 to 15 veins on the leaf. So you can take a piece of the leaf off, hold it up to the sunlight and try to count, or you can bring it back to the lab and look at it under a dissecting scope. Sometimes there are stipules or an extra leaf that kind of hangs off of here, but it's usually on the upper portion of the plant. However, it can fall off and disappear later in the season. So again, you might have less to work with when it comes to IDing this one in particular, but it loves flowing systems and it loves to thrive in those environments. We have clasping leaf pondweed. So this one has a high tolerance to disturbances. This one also doesn't have any floating leaves, and you can see the leaves are much longer in comparison to heart pondweed overall, and they have 13 to 21 veins on the leaf itself. Some can be more prominent than others, so you can kind of see some of them are a little bit darker than others. And it doesn't completely wrap around the stem. Sometimes it'll wrap around halfway or 3/4 of the way around the main stem. And this one does have stipules, again, that are a bit more fibrous. So I have one on this here. Oh, right here. Here's a stipule. It's kind of almost translucent here coming off of the main stem. And this one can also produce a fruit-packed cylindrical spike or flower up at the surface as well. So you can kind of see all the seeds up in here, and you can pluck one of those off, look at it under a dissecting scope as well. We have leafy pondweed. Again, pondweeds are going to be your most difficult ones to ID typically, just because there are so many and so many different options. So these don't typically produce floating leaves, and the submersed leaves are a bit more elongated and narrow. And they typically have 3 to 5 veins here and a mid vein right down the center. So a lot of times when I'm in the field, I'll pluck off a leaf, I'll hold it up to the sun, look at it, and look for that mid vein, which has lacunae cells on either side here. This one has no nodal glands. So typically a nodal gland would be found here, and is usually a bit more swollen. So you can kind of look for that, but this doesn't have that. Sometimes it'll produce seeds in clusters, just like this. And those seeds are more round shaped, and they have a dorsal wavy ridge along the side of the seed and a shortened beak. So that's the beak. And so this one is produced early on in the season. So sometimes, again, you might see it with seeds, sometimes you might not. But that's definitely why we have more than one characteristic we're looking at. Yeah.
Do you see any like differences in climate change in some of these, like blooming periods, right?
Mm-hmm.
For some of these.
Oh, yeah. I mean, for these plants, I've been seeing them longer periods of time for them survive. I mean, I still have people bringing back plants currently, and typically that's not normal. Usually a lot of the stuff starts dying back like end of September, I mean, some of the plants aren't in great shape. Others are, of course, some of the invasives are in better shapes than others. But as far as climate change, that's something definitely to consider as well. Sago pondweed. So this one can thrive in turbid waters and is a prolific tuber producer as well. So tubers are essentially seeds. And so this one has needle-like leaves that protrude out and they come to a sharp point. So this one's kind of more dainty in comparison to leafy pondweed overall. And they have a forked pattern that comes off of the stem here. It's almost like a fan sort of look to it. And so this one tends to create these seeds that protrude off of a stem here. So they kind of almost look like flowers, but that's not the case. Again, the seeds look very similar to leafy pondweed with a short beak and a dorsal ridge. And these seeds are actually in a whorl around this stem that it comes off of here. We have horned pondweed. So this one was the first one I ever ID'd in the Musconetcong River. So this was exciting find for me back in the day. So this one is actually considered not a true pondweed, as you can see based on the Latin name here. That's a taxonomy question. I am not a taxonomist, so don't ask me about that. But this one is a prolific seed producer, and the plant overall has kind of a fine, stringy, like stem appearance, almost kind of like fishing line. And it produces these clusters of seeds here. And the seed is very iconic in comparison to other pondweeds, where it's a bit more elongated or an oval shape with a dorsal ridge and more of a prominent beak or an elongated beak here. This one can produce over 2 million fruit in 6 months. So this one is a good one to have, provides great habitat for wildlife as well. And the leaves off of the stem, this picture doesn't really do it justice, but are usually either in an opposite or a whorled pattern. Wild celery. This one is also referred to as tape grass or eelgrass, and typically prefers firmer substrates, but it can thrive in a variety of different substrates as well. And it can thrive in a variety of different water quality environments. This plant in particular produces banana-shaped tubers, so that helps it root into the system. I don't have a picture of it up here, but if you imagine a banana shape, that's kind of what they look like. And these long ribbon-like leaves are kind of transparent, and they have hollow cells that you can see here. And typically it'll produce female flowers on a spiraled stalk, so kind of like a corkscrew. And then it produces this white flower here. So this is a really important waterfowl food source as well. Water stargrass looks kind of similar to wild celery, but is much smaller in comparison as far as leaf measurement wise, and also by just overall plant length in general. This one again is not a pondweed, but in fact part of the pickerel weed family, which is actually more of an emergent. So with this one in particular, this one produces a yellow flower. In my time, I have only seen it flower 2 times in New Jersey, so it's very rare to see that. So if you're one of the lucky few who gets to see that, take a picture. And so the stems can be slightly flat and slightly branched overall. They typically lack an overall stipule, and the leaves generally lack a midvein. There's no distinct midvein to see. And again, this one tends to hang out closer to the emergence on the shoreline. It is native. It is native. Yeah. And so we have coontail here, which many people say is a nuisance, or it can become a nuisance at nuisance densities overall. And so this one is really cool because it kind of reminds me of a raccoon tail, per coon tail. And it has more of a feathery or fan-like appearance. So sometimes based on the water chemistry of where you're finding this plant, sometimes it might have a crunchy feel to it, especially if there's higher calcium levels. But this one has leaves that are arranged in circular whorls around the stems here. So you can kind of see that. Around 5 to 12 leaflets around the stem overall. This one doesn't necessarily have a true root system. You can find it rooted, but a lot of times you can find it just floating along. This one does produce seeds as well. I don't have a picture up here of what that looks like, but a lot of times you'll see the seeds kind of like tucked into here, or sometimes at the tip here, they're sort of a pinkish color overall. And that's just one of its reproductive strategies as well. So muskgrass, so this one is technically a macroalgae. It's not necessarily a true plant, but we do come across it a lot. So sometimes we do count it when we're doing our surveys. So this one, again, has no true root system, but actually reproduces through rhizoids. So the branches are more ridged, and it branches multiple times. And again, this one can often become calcified, again, depending on what your water quality is. But really the key way to identifying this is when you pull it up out of the water, it has a musky or skunky smell to it. And you know right away, you're like, oh, that's muskgrass, like right away. So, you know, it's okay if you're smelling plants because you're trying to ID it. So, all right, so we have water moss. So this one in particular is a Fontinalis species. So looking at the leaf arrangement, they're more triangular lance-shaped leaves that are super densely packed. So you can kind of see this little colony here. And the leaves are kind of arranged in 3 rows along the stem. And again, they can appear with colors, you know, brownish to greenish. A lot of times you're going to see this stuck on rocks, logs, so on and so forth. Again, like other mosses, it doesn't really have a true root system. But a lot of times you'll find this in the slow flowing systems as well.
Question.
Yeah.
For these that don't have true root systems, they consider parasitic?
I don't think so. I'm not sure. That's a great question. I'd have to look into that. So again, if you have an area within the river that kind of goes off to the side and is a bit more ponded or very, very slow sections, you may have some white lily or yellow lily colonies present. So white lily, per the name, has typically a white flower. I have seen pinkish looking flowers. It is still white water lily. However, you do have to be careful because from the ornamental trade, things can escape. So definitely keep your eyes peeled for that. And one of the ways to identify this one is by looking at the leaf shape overall. So depending on where you're from in New Jersey, it's either Taylor ham or pork roll. And if you're not from New Jersey, then it's Pac-Man. So that's kind of the shape, what that looks like. And then we have spatterdock, also known as yellow water lily, is more of this heart-shaped leaf here. So that's the ways that you can kind of tell these two apart. And a lot of times, especially when the water level is significantly lower, you'll see these like lily pads start to stand up out of the water a lot of times. You have your duckweeds, so your small duckweed, per the name, it is very small. This one has more round to oval shaped leaves. The leaves in the literature are referred to as fronds. And you'll see here that there's typically only one root that comes off of each leaf. So that's how you can tell that that is small duckweed. It's usually intermixed with great duckweed, which we have here, which is more of an irregular oval shaped leaves. And you can kind of see, again, take it with a grain of salt. Typically it's a purple color when you flip the leaves on its underside. And it typically has 5 to 12 roots that come off of the leaf. And also I wanted to point out that you'll see this little dot here. There's a couple of dots that are on these leaves. That's also another giveaway to show that is great duckweed. Now, it doesn't always have those, but that's something to look out for.
If it has it, is it macro or micro?
If it has it, it's macro. Yeah. Okay, so now the next few slides are going to be, we're going to be talking about ones to look out for. Not that I've necessarily confirmed whether or not they're in the Musconetcong is another story. But of course, this is my plug for clean, drain, dry. Please clean, drain, dry your boats, your kayaks, clean your boots, your waders, your fishing gear, because that's one of the ways that we can try to prevent the spread of invasive species. It depends on what species. Yeah.
That
Yeah, so there.
months they'll sit dry and then.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So there have been a few studies actually done in Canada where they've tested out different plant species and different water temperatures as well as far as cleaning, because certain temperatures don't work for everything. So that's something else that you have to look into as well. So it's kind of species specific. I'll talk about it in a little bit, but we put together a decontamination plan that kind of goes over that. So we'll talk about that in a bit. So this is water chestnut. So this is pretty prevalent throughout the state. Again, this is native to Europe, Asia, and Africa. It has hardy, robust stems with these floating leaves or floating rosettes. And they have more of a triangular shape here, but they're serrated. So they kind of have that sawtooth margin. And so it actually has these, you can kind of see a little bit here, kind of like these air-filled sacs that help keep it above the water for buoyancy. And you can kind of see these nutlets or fruits that it produces. And it usually produces 4 spikes on the nutlet. And what happens is that will fall into the sediment, reroot, overwinter, and come back the next year. What's really also terrible about this plant is that just from one of these, it can produce up to 20 plants per rosette.
Lake Musconetcong.
Right, exactly, Lake Musconetcong. Yes, and Amwell Lake up in Amwell as well. So this one is definitely not one that you want. And it can also produce, when it's really happy, a white flower in the middle of the rosette. And it can stay dormant for over 10 years. Something else that is of concern with this plant is that these nutlets can wash up along the beach or the shorelines. And if you're not wearing proper foot gear and you step on one of those, you can get a really nasty infection. So this is definitely one to be on the lookout for. And if you noticed, there's one sitting right there in the white lilies.
As well.
Yeah, so it can actually cling on to waterfowl, like if they're just going by and then they pick it up and then they don't know and then they just fly off to another lake or river. That's also another vector of spread as well. So European frogbit. This is kind of similar to a giant duckweed overall. So it kind of has these heart-shaped leaves, but they're typically less than 6 centimeters in diameter, and they have kind of a leathery texture to them. It almost feels like a fake plant, but it's not. But rarely is it actually anchored to the sediment. It kind of just like floats along in certain areas. It might reroot kind of thing, especially right up on the shoreline. So it can produce this white flower here with 3 petals typically. So this was actually recently found in Chester behind the mall in that river system. So that's something that I personally want to look into further as far as maybe where the source came from or where it wasn't an aquarium dump, that sort of thing. So this can also spread through kind of a runner root system. So it can just kind of become a tangled mess. Oh yeah. Oh
I
yeah.
wonder how many of these.
Oh yeah. And unfortunately, people think that they're doing like, oh, I'm like saving it by like releasing it. And it's like, I know positive motive behind it, but that's not necessarily the case. So,
We find aquariums usually up here at shirts.
okay.
One of those positive spots for, a dump.
Yeah.
So it would be close to a road or a bridge or whatever.
Well, they find a water.
It could be
and they
anywhere.
literally will dump the entire aquarium and leave the aquarium.
Oh, yeah.
They'll just leave the whole thing.
Yeah. One of the projects that I worked on previously, I mean, we found right at the river where we were, managing hydrilla, and there were all these little tiny colorful rocks that somebody dumped their aquarium into, and it's maybe it came from there, So speaking of hydrilla, so hydrilla, this is considered the perfect invasive species. So there are actually now 13 biotypes throughout the world. Originally, there were only 2 biotypes in the US, but now there's 3 because a new one was recently found in Connecticut. So that's brand new news. So this was originally introduced from the aquarium trade in the 1960s and has become widespread in the Southeast. And botanists for years said, oh yeah, it can't overwinter, up north, and then climate change, and here we are. So this one tolerates a wide variety of different habitats, from sandy bottoms to muddy bottoms, mixed bottoms, and it can thrive in flowing, non-flowing systems. It can tolerate salinity levels up to, I believe, about 2 to 3 parts per trillion, and a variety of water chemistries. And this plant can actually alter the chemistry to make it more beneficial for it to grow.
I
And
was gonna ask you.
Yeah.
A number of these salt tolerant they are, and how close, the river, like, there's some brackish water. Maybe we're talking about the Delaware or something.
yeah. So certain plants can tolerate. The majority of freshwater plants can't. They don't do too well with salinity. But again, it depends on what species. Certain ones can tolerate more than others. And what's really interesting about this plant is that it can grow in 1% of light. So that's like, imagine putting it in a closet, blocking off all the light and everything, and it'll still grow. It gets 1% of light, right? So this one can grow up to 25 feet long. And this typically has leaves in a whorl, typically 4 to 8 leaves, sometimes 3. Generally, you're not going to see that. You're going to see it more likely in 5 leaves in a whorl around the main stem. And again, you can kind of see with the naked eye the serrated edges of the leaves right here. So this reproduces not only through fragmentation, but through tubers and turions. Turions, they're kind of like bud-like seeds that get produced right in the axil here. They fall off into the sediment and reproduce again. And the seeds can stay dormant in the sediment for over 10 years. So, yep. Mm-hmm.
Isn't that, I know, not pain, but like, isn't the new phenotype up in Connecticut considered it three phenotypes now? Or am I just like, maybe it's a branch of the phenotype that's happening now?
Yeah, it might be. That gets
Yeah.
into the nitty gritty genetics of
Yeah,
it.
so you've got the two biotypes here in Connecticut, because I went to the plant camp last year, and I'm just like.
Right, yeah.
This was a new, like,
Yeah, no, and that one can produce even more like more than like 8
yeah, the
leaves.
terpenes were like
And they're all,
prolific and nonsensically.
yeah, they're,
Yeah.
yeah, the US Army Corps of Engineers is still working on like trying to figure all that out, so, yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah, and that's miles and miles of river. So here we have hydrilla, which we just talked about. And then we have Brazilian Aladia. So this is actively being sold in pet stores. However, if you walked into a pet store and said, I'd like some Brazilian Aladia, they're not going to know what you're talking about. But if you said anacarist, then they would know, oh, you're talking about Brazilian Aladia. Again, names. So they tend to rename certain plants to something, I guess, prettier. But with Brazilian Aladia, you're typically going to have leaves in whorls of 4 to 6. Again, they can go up to 8. This one has a much more robust appearance in comparison to hydrilla. This one does not produce any tubers or turions. And this one kind of reminds me, it has more of like a bottle brush appearance to it, it kind of looks like to me. And the leaves are finely serrated, so you wouldn't be able to see right off the bat if they're serrated or not. And this one originally came from South America. And so we have all of our water weeds put together to kind of see how they can be a look-alike to each other. So really paying attention to some of those identifying characteristics that we went over. This one's got 5 leaves in a whorl with serrated edges. This one has 3 leaves in a whorl, and this one has 6 leaves in a whorl with finely serrated edges. So you can kind of see side by side here. They all produce flowers. However, Brazilian Aladia produces a bit of a larger white flower that typically has 3 petals on it. So definitely something to reference when you're out in the field. And how many invasive aquatic plants are there? Too many. Too many for me to go over today. But this is just a quick snapshot of a few more. So as far as what's been found near New Jersey, we've found most recently, it was reported that water soldier, which was originally found in Canada, has now been found in New York, planted by somebody, unfortunately. So now they're currently trying to determine what the extent of the population is, and so on and so forth with that. Starry stonewort, also in New York. This is actually macroalgae. So some studies are being done on that. Giant salvinia was found 3 years ago in New York, more than likely in an aquarium dump, actually found during the first plant camp that we hosted. And we do have a few populations of the sacred lotus throughout New Jersey currently, not to be confused with the American lotus, which is considered rare, threatened, and endangered. So those are just a few. Okay, so what is New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection doing about this, if anything? So as of, I believe it was a year or 2 ago now, with the help of New Jersey Water Supply Authority, working with the Mid-Atlantic Invasive Species Work Group, decided to apply for funding to create an aquatic invasive species management plan. So the first step was hiring a contractor to develop that plan. That was developed by Little Bear Environmental Consulting. And we formed a local work group with the help of Musconetcong Watershed. Thank you again for your contributions on that. And we also had a separate work group through the Water Monitoring Council to develop a decontamination plan, which again, Musconetcong Watershed was a part of and helped contribute to that. So thank you again.
See the snakehead there.
Yep. So this covers all invasive aquatic species. So from fish to plants to crayfish to the mussels.
It cracks me up. This snakehead were invasive species. You hear stories, but and now they're starting to promote it as a game fish.
That's a rebranding.
Yep. Yeah, that's a tough topic on that one.
So, like, fishermen. I just,
The way to get
It's-
people to catch them and kill them.
Yes.
yeah, but
It's a tough sell.
It is tough. That's a
Yeah.
tough one. That's
Because they're a fun catch is,
Mhm.
you know, I don't fish for them exclusively, but
mhm.
from my angler friends, I hear that that's a prized fun fish to catch.
And-
It's desperate to catch them. Yeah,
And-
herring is desperate to catch them, right? So put them back.
Right.
Or kill them and let them,
Yeah.
the buzzards have them. I mean, either way, you're contributing to the ecosystem. But yeah,
Yeah.
not something if you are a trout fisherman and or care about your ecosystem that you want to hang around.
Yeah.
that's the thing, right? Like, what are they doing to native species?
Well, right, they're.
Out competing and eating.
They're gonna out-
Eating and
Yeah.
out competing. Yep.
That's the thing about
They're the problem.
invasives, right? They
Right.
outcompete.
Out
They don't
compete.
have native predators.
So they-
That's the problem.
They, sorry, getting off the plants up there. The snakeheads have made it up into New Jersey now, because I heard originally they were like in Chesapeake Bay area, of course down south,
Mhm.
like now they're in New Jersey.
Yeah.
I heard they're calling them the Chana.
Chana Argus is the
Chana
Latin.
Argus.
is the
Yeah,
Latin.
They've rebranded them, just kind of, you know, I mean, that happens to fish and pond names quite frequently.
Mm-hmm.
To bring attention, to bring focus, to bring sportsmen, you know, to put different types of pressure. So, yeah, it's the same fish, but maybe with different pressure put on it, so that, you know, environmentally balanced.
On the catch, but then it's kind of like missing the point.
Well, right, you catch them and then
But they find.
dispatch them
And
and
they take
then take a
Words
picture.
aggressively and fishermen like that stuff.
Right, you don't want them in the water, yeah, it's a
Right.
fun catch, but you don't want to keep
Right.
catching them.
Right. And I believe it was Maryland or Rhode Island. I can't recall which. They actually had a festival where they encouraged people to catch, kill,
Right.
because they had such a problem. And at the festival, they were actually cooking the fish and eating them.
I
So-
typically eat too.
Right.
And, you know, this is just like Florida, right? Like, there's an
Right.
invasive species problem, like nobody's business
Yep.
in Florida. They have python catches and kills, and alligators even now at that
Oh,
point,
yeah.
right? They were an endangered species like white-tailed deer, but now they've gone the other way for protections, and so now you have these alligator catches and kills, and so, you know, it's a wildlife management issue. Right,
Yeah.
it's like, it's not just leave one thing alone forever, right?
Mhm.
You have to obviously keep managing, because human pressures constantly change, right? Squirrels, deer,
Yep.
Like our people
Yeah.
may be misguided and, well, the ones who kids, like that, you know.
Mhm.
right, no,
Spread them out.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
put them in more waterways and it's kind of like what happened walking up fast.
Well, right, they think it's a
Right,
game
they
thing,
think.
and then they go in, and then they, you know, but the education and the outreach is key.
Great.
Sorry.
Letting.
No,
people-
you're good.
No, and this is always.
Yeah, this is, yeah.
Outreach and education is always the key to letting people know what's
Do you
going
think
on.
the
Yeah,
snake
it's fun
catch-
fish to catch. What is that?
Oh, they're,
Right, if it's in your environment.
maybe there's another invasive that needs help.
Well, funny that
Biological
you
control.
ask about biological control. There have been studies with particular plants, where there was one in particular where they were like, oh yeah, well, if we put sterile grass carp in, oh, maybe they'll eat this, and then they eat all the good things, all the natives first, because of course you're gonna want to eat the tasty thing first, and then the invasive, like the last one, and then they eat everything, and then it's, yeah. a mess.
Yours first.
Right, look up cane toads.
There you go. Yes. So this plan was released for public comment the end of December until February of this year, and was signed and approved by Governor Murphy May 9th, 2024. So if you are interested in looking at the plan further, here is the link. And of course, this is just a little infographic about what the New Jersey Invasive Species Management Plan can help. How can we prevent or intercept AIS pathways? And these are just a few different scenarios pictured here as to how invasive species get into these waterways or into these water bodies, and different ways that we can help prevent or try to intercept, to kind of mitigate this through AIS public outreach, creating aquarium disposal drop-offs so that they don't dump it into the waterway, having boat stewards or water stewards at boat launches with cleaning stations, collecting data, understanding how these boats are moving across New Jersey, regulating the sales of vegetation and bait through these aquarium trades, and working with nonprofits with their volunteer stream monitors and stream monitoring programs, and doing surveys and conducting management. So these are just all of the ways that we can try to contribute to this overall. Thank you for your time, and thank you, Musconetcong Watershed, for inviting me here tonight.
Here.